write-up that came out of that meeting on the ACBA WhatsApp group. And there was a brief engagement around that issue. And then David Obura, who was following this very, very closely, shared with the members on the WhatsApp group a short piece he had written reflecting on this particular issue. And his piece was called Financial Transformations Needed to Address the Nature and Climate Change Crisis. The link to this was shared. And essentially this Summit for a New Global Financing Pact was looking at the creation of international biodiversity market by creating what they're calling biodiversity credits, and that you would end up with a global nature market is what they are proposing, and that way you'll be able to mobilize money, there'll be lots of money, and that somehow we will be able to address the biodiversity loss and climate crisis because of that, and that it would resolve all our past failures. I'm just giving my personal commentary on that. So then I thought, this is really an important development. But we cannot talk about biodiversity credits and carbon credits. Why not ecosystem credits? But the whole idea of having carbon credits, what exactly does it mean? And how do we, as actors that are in this biodiversity space, begin to engage and to understand what does this actually mean, and how do we start to influence this? At the summit, France and the UK committed that they would lead consultations to develop a framework and also to initiate pilots to test this whole idea of a global, of creating biodiversity credits. So that's what they've undertaken to do. And that they would have this framework ready to present at the next CBD COP in Turkey. So out of this, I started to think that this is really an important thing that is beginning to develop, and that this is something that the ACBA members and various other actors that are in this space really need to engage and try to understand what exactly does this mean, what are its implications, and is this something that is likely to work? So I had a chat with David, and David kindly agreed. He was traveling, and he agreed that he would join as he's in a taxi, and I see that he's now joined. So what I thought is, why don't we have David present his thinking based on this piece that he's written on financial transformations. And then I reached out to African Center for Biodiversity, Mariam, and spoke to her that, we would also appreciate an alternative voice and a perspective on this whole idea of these biodiversity credits and a global market for biodiversity. And she kindly put us in touch with one of her colleagues who in ACB who kindly agreed to join, and that he would provide his perspectives on this issue, on the concept and what it means, and sort of a critique around this issue. So we have essentially two speakers. We have David Obura, who will kind of lead the discussion, and then after that we'll invite Stephen Greenberg, who will then share with us his perspectives. And then after that, we would really like to invite people to to jump in, to ask questions, very critical questions, if you have comments, you can make those comments so that we have a healthy discussion. And maybe towards the end, we can also say, okay, perhaps we can come up with a few next steps. How do we continue to engage on this issue? And if indeed there is going to be this framework and these consultations to lead to a framework that will be presented at COP16, what are some of the ways in which we can be able to engage and try to influence what goes into that, and perhaps begin to advocate for different kinds of positions. So that's what we have.
Donc merci beaucoup Yemi pour cette introduction bien explicative. Je vois dans le chat que Monsieur David explique qu'il est à l'aéroport, qu'il n'a pas la possibilité de bien s'exprimer. Je ne sais pas si on lui donne quelques minutes pour intervenir juste rapidement. Et si ça ne marche pas, on passera la parole aux deux autres intervenants qui seront là. Et après, on prendra donc les interventions des participants. Je ne sais pas si Monsieur David peut dire quelque chose.
Can we first? No, thanks, Chair. David is online, so let's first defer to David, and then if David is able, he seems to be connected. David can make his presentation, and then that can be followed by Stephen, and then we can then open it to broader discussion.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Yemi.
So Dr. Obiro, David, please.
Okay. Thanks, Yemi. Thanks, Chair. Let me know if you can hear my sound well enough. I'm on the airport bus right now.
We can hear
I'll be walking. But if the sound is okay, I can continue. So
it's okay, David. You can continue.
Okay. Okay, let me continue. Fortunately, I hadn't prepared a PowerPoint or anything like that. I just thought I would speak. Yemi has, and I see on the chat, you've kindly shared the link to the article that I wrote, so people can look at that, and I'll sort of read a bit from the summary from that. So I'll preface this. It's great to be with you all. It's been a few meetings since I haven't been with ACBA members since the COP process. Now I went to this Global Financial Fact meeting through a side contact through a journalist, and in listening to the discussions there and reading about these carbon credits. I mean, we know quite a lot about that and how carbon markets are emerging. There's an increasing talk about biodiversity credits and them not being in any way mature yet, linking biodiversity to carbon credits. And of course, the biggest thought that goes up in my mind is the problem is these are solutions that are very financially oriented solutions. They come from market systems. They come from within the same system that has created many of the challenges that we're trying to address. So will they actually be solutions? And I think it's really important that we in Africa have a very strong handle on these to ask broader questions about why, how, what are our limits and boundaries, how do we move forward? So I was at a breakfast meeting with Mia Motley herself, which was a great opportunity to do that. I didn't really have much option to speak because it was full of high-level finance people and very little time. So I wrote up this document just to summarize the main concepts there. So first, let me start with the ending point for the comments, if you're able to look at the summary. And this is that given that we're going to be dealing with a market financial system, there are going to be proposals coming from this. How much do we know about the dangers of financial systems and privatization and so on? I think, we have had a lot of discussions around this already. And the absolute need for any such solutions to be done in the context of commons approaches that really ensure that the ownership and the rights of communities, people on the ground, the host countries are really front and center, so that while you might be identifying some way to put financial value or trading value to biodiversity assets that they can't be taken away. They can't just be traded to a company. The company goes bankrupt, it goes to a bank, somebody buys that from the bank, and then they do whatever they want with it. We have to be able to make sure that these assets are controlled at source and the rights are held with the rights holders on the ground. So then in listening to all the discussions around financial debt and the debt crises, which is what the meeting was about, the solutions that Prime Minister Motley is proposing, she has a senior advisor who's an economist, make a lot of sense from people dealing with national level debt, large amounts of finance and so on. But they don't really come down to the ground level. And when I made an intervention in the meeting, the main challenge really from her financial advisor was that biodiversity doesn't make money. So they can't really talk about it yet. Carbon makes money, so they can devise these solutions for climate crises and markets and so on, and these sort of debt-related interventions. But biodiversity doesn't do that yet, and certainly not at a local scale in the way that economists and financial people think about it. So that's a big challenge. So then I think an important point coming to the first paragraph in the summary is that what has happened, and this is the work I've been doing with the Earth Commission over the years, is that it's clear that global trade has really basically extracted natural resources from Asia, Africa, the oceans, South America, various parts of the world, and converted that into financial assets, which have been accumulated in the global north, as well as in elites now in developing country regions as well. So it's essentially a transfer of natural assets, climate and biodiversity assets, into financial assets held by certain people. Now, in addressing climate and biodiversity crises, the concepts of loss and damage and halt and reverse decline have come up, and I think they apply equally in both. So loss and damage is in the climate space for emergencies and costs that arise from past actions that current crises can be attributed to. So emergency costs are paid from sources that are responsible. So primarily the global north at the moment. But then halt and reverse in the biodiversity space goes further. It goes to actually halting declines and reversing. So reinvesting in biodiversity assets to build them up, so you would not then need the types of funds that loss and damage would relate to. But both of these concepts are critically important. I think they're linked and sequential in a way, and they need to be applied in both climate and biodiversity. And then what that then takes you to is that to reduce loss and damage to the minimum, to rebuild biodiversity assets, climate assets, so reduce carbon in the atmosphere, we need to spend money. We know that it's going to be costly. There's a lot of aid that's focused around this. But essentially what this is doing is it's transferring financial assets back into the nature and the climate assets that have been degraded through the type of uses that we've had in the past. Basically, the financial systems and the tax systems have enabled the owners of capital to extract a lot and to not restore what they're taking out and to not pay for the costs of that extraction over time. So, I mean, a lot of growth could have happened in the past if climate and biodiversity assets had been maintained. There would be less financial assets because, of course, a lot of that money would have had to be reinvested. It wouldn't have appeared as profit, but still there would be greater financial assets. So it's really balancing these two types of assets that we have. And that's what this discussion is about. It's about the debt crisis is really a problem of the imbalance in financial assets between the North and the South. And the climate and biodiversity crises are also a mirror image of that, so between the North and the South. So the transformation of financial systems that is needed to restore balance, to transfer financial assets back into natural assets and climate assets, we need that to occur. We're all negotiating that right now. That's what the GBF is about. That's what a lot of discussions in the climate convention are about. But if it's done from the same principles as we've had until now, It just can't be done. Those principles don't really allow it. I don't know what principles would allow it, but I think it's really important that we, somehow get a handle on these ideas of what has happened in terms of transferring natural wealth to financial wealth and what needs to happen to reverse that. And if we do that well, we can restore the natural assets, not to the same state as before, but to a healthy functioning state. But the ownership of those natural assets is critical. And that has to be held in what are called, I guess, global commons or local commons types approaches. I think we can really capitalize on the work of Elinor Ostrom. This is what people are talking about in academic spheres. But I think she would be, and she was she's a Nobel Prize winning social scientist who's really pointed to the value systems in communities, in indigenous systems, and so on. So people talk about the Ostrom principles, and it's useful to label them as that. But what she's really describing is communitarian systems that have existed in the past and exist now and can still exist in the future in new forms. So can we emphasize and build new approaches? And how do we as the ACBA community contribute to that discussion? Okay, I see a crowd coming my way, and I've got to the end of what I initially intended to say. So I'll go on mute and hand back to Yemi or the chair. I'm not sure which way to go. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur David. Merci pour tout cet éclairage, malgré le fait que vous êtes dans une zone assez perturbée pour le moment. Je pense que nous avons tous suivi avec attention les éléments que vous ajoutez au débat sur cette question qui est liée aux discussions récentes qui ont eu lieu sur Paris et surtout sur la difficulté aujourd'hui à intervenir sur ces questions. Donc, il faut trouver des réponses, il faut trouver des arguments, il faut que ACBA se prépare justement et que l'Afrique se prépare à capitaliser sur les travaux techniques que vous avez déjà mentionnés dans l'article qui a été produit, mais aussi certainement sur les autres propositions qui seront faites par les autres membres. Donc, merci à vous. Est-ce que nous avons quelques questions pour Monsieur David avant de passer la parole à notre prochain intervenant? Est-ce que any other idea, any contribution? Someone want to take the floor after what was said by Mr. David? If not, can we have then est-ce que nous pouvons donc avoir notre prochain invité, Monsieur Stephen Greenberg, du Centre africain pour la biodiversité, qui va nous donner une présentation sur le plan d'action NBSAP pour l'Afrique du Sud. Est-ce qu'il est en ligne? En même temps, j'ai vu une contribution dans... Yes, can you take the floor, please?
Can you hear me?
Yes, Mr. Stephen. Can you take the floor then?
Oh, yes, sure.
Give us your point.
All right, thanks. You can hear me. Yeah, thanks for this. My name is Stephen Greenberg. I'm with the African Centre for Biodiversity based in Johannesburg in South Africa. I kind of was parachuted in here in the last minute, so this isn't my area of specialization, but we do kind of look at these issues from a political economy point of view and from a systemic point of view. And I think that there are certain things we can say about credits and offsets. So I'll just speak about 3 areas, and I'll try and be relatively brief. The one is just a general critique of offsets and credits. The second one is around finance, and the third one is around potential alternatives that we could start thinking about. at the outset, I would say that we're very skeptical about this whole approach. I mean, I think we've seen the failure of carbon credits, a failure to actually respond to the issues of climate change. But of course, some people are benefiting and making money out of that. Very low prices attached to carbon. And these credits are kind of a wedge for the commodification of nature, as if that hasn't already happened. It's to expand that a lot. Now, when these when supposed solutions put the financial entities at the center, this is a big problem, because these are the ones that have most substantially contributed to the multiple crises we are finding ourselves in now. And I think David did allude to that to some extent. If you think of what their objectives are, that's not really about stemming biodiversity loss. That's not their interest as banks and financial institutions. They are rather more interested in allowing corporations to continue with their profit-making activities, whether these are destructive of biodiversity or not. And they also want themselves to see ways in which they can make money off efforts to preserve biodiversity or respond to climate change or whatever, including through things like derivatives, which are secondary markets, that allows you just to use biodiversity as a kind of a leverage point to build up a whole lot of other markets that are detached from reality. And then there's also things like hedging and shorting. So you can have a situation where you have secondary markets that allow for hedging, and it actually doesn't matter what happens on the ground, because if you're shorting derivatives, or if you're shorting a market, you would basically say this thing's going to fail and we're going to bet on it failing. And so people can make money even if these systems fail. So I do think that the way that they've been set up so far, you can see quite clearly that offsets and credits are a means to justify and rationalize harmful projects, which would otherwise not have been able to receive financing from the international banking sector. So it allows corporations to do damage and then pay somebody a lower rate as a kind of supposed counterbalance. This transfers risks onto marginalized communities to manage fragile environments so that others can keep destroying biodiversity elsewhere, and that's what happens. Other impacts on local communities include things like forced removals, displacement, and restricting the activities and land uses of communities in distant locations. There is a situation also where you can see that there's a destruction of critical habitats even before the project developer has demonstrated that the credits or offsets are operational or even effective. And there is evidence already that many offset programs have not even started yet. So on the basis of a proposed offset program, you can go ahead and do your damage, and then later on you can see whether the offset works. By then it's too late. There's really limited accountability or incentive for implementation. I think that people here probably are very aware of how difficult it is actually to get any transparency or accountability in corporations. So how are they going to be transparent in this situation? This idea of net zero loss is a similar problem. It doesn't respond to the need for restoration. So it allows for business as usual, which leads to ongoing destruction and loss. There's no net restoration, and the same economic and extractive system remains in place. I think again, offsets in the form of commodification, which I'll just touch on a little bit later, but we can see that offsets are going to require a very simplified and standardized process for assessing ecological damage. Everything has to be quantified. It has to be calculated. It has to be turned into like a numerical value so that you can actually use it as a kind of a finance-based measure. So what happens to things like social, cultural, and spiritual values of the loss of biodiversity? What happens to indigenous knowledge, which can't necessarily be quantified in the ways that would be required to financialize a system like this? So the Nature Finance report on biodiversity credits, which is in favor of these credits, itself says that there's a danger that the assessment process or your methodology creates a situation where only that which can be measured by technology is considered. It's also founded on the assumption that science has accumulated a complete and comprehensive understanding of how ecosystem functionalities in very complex habitats, which are characterized by interconnected ecological processes, could be recreated elsewhere. It's not actually true that science has all that knowledge, and it's not true that you can say that ecologically unique habitats could just be substituted on a like-for-like basis with other habitats. So I'll just quickly turn to the issue of finances. I mean, obviously, there's a need to fund ecological maintenance, but the question is whether there's a positive role for financial capital in the current context, where they have so much power and where they're basically driving a lot of the destruction that we're seeing today. Even in the face of obvious need to cut greenhouse gas emissions, for example, they are continuing to finance oil and gas exploration and extraction. So, I mean, even going back further than that, we have to ask who owes whom. We can see that extraction has been occurring in Africa, not only Africa, but in fact, for most of the global South. Both historically through colonization, but also currently through debt as one of the main issues. I mean, slavery has basically fueled all the economic growth in the US and Europe. Advanced capitalist countries have built their economies on the basis of externalizing costs onto colonized environments and people, including in Africa. And then after colonialism, debt has been used as another means of extraction. Even though countries, if you look at the original debts that were accrued or the original loans, those things have been paid back multiple times. But somehow countries find themselves in a debt trap now where they can't escape from that. Once you have a debt situation, you're going to be seeking any source of finances anyway. So it really puts people on a back foot. When you come up with ideas of credits, all of this kind of stuff, it's a source of financing. Countries are under pressure to repay debts, and they can't cover their own priorities well enough. So they're always going to be looking and seeing these opportunities as something which could be positive, even though it's further extraction. I think just talking about commodification and turning nature into a source of extractable wealth, which is controlled then by these financial institutions. Segmentation, which is decomposing the social and economic world into more and more precisely defined constituent elements. So that's actually breaking up the social world into more abstract elements or attributes. Quantifying these, so configuring each element into a measurable entity with attributes of risk. And this allows these, in principle, to be comparable with other elements. This is the next step in financialization. So this is what the like-for-like measurement is. How do you create a system where two elements, which may not be the same, get reduced to a financial or like a numerical system, and then they can be compared with each other. It's a very crudification of the real world. The third step is commodification, which is about trading each of these attributes of risks through securities or derivatives or insurance markets. So these are just new sites for capital accumulation. They're not going to resolve the problem of ongoing biodiversity loss. As we can see very clearly, so far, these kinds of systems haven't worked in the carbon, in the greenhouse gas emissions section. Just very quickly, a couple of potential alternatives that we can at least start thinking about. we need to start from a frame of reparations. Does Africa really owe the rest of the world anything at this time? I mean, if we look at the history of the rise of capitalism and the economic system, I mean, is Africa really supposed to be still indebted to other countries? On what basis? Who caused the damages? So, I mean, I think this is very well known that it's consumption in the north, and not only talking about the north physically, but also talking about the north and the south. So this is wealthier individuals and classes with higher consumption, and then the fallout tends to fall on those people who are relying on natural resources for their livelihoods. So David did talk about the loss and damage idea in the climate discussion, which is based on justice. I think this is one thing that we could look at a little bit more, although obviously there are questions about how would you measure that. A second idea could be debt write-offs. This is something which people are pushing across the board, including on climate. If we're having a situation where African, I'm just talking about Africa now, where African governments are highly indebted, a large portion of whatever they earn in revenue goes immediately out of the country to repay those debts. Then you've got all your social programs, all your economic activities, investment, all of that you want to do. You can't do that. These debts need to be written off as odious debts in order to allow countries themselves to make decisions about how they utilize their resources. I mean, if we look at the way that governments in the north printed trillions to save the banks in 2008, and again to manage a fallout of COVID in their own countries, then there can't really be an argument that it's impossible to write off the debt of African countries and allow them to start from a clean slate. Another possibility is around taxation, looking at taxation on windfall profits. If you look at the huge profits that are being made by oil companies now and food companies in the face of a war in Ukraine, really there should be taxes on these profits, and those should be reallocated and put into funds, for example, on biodiversity and climate. Another option is wealth or consumption taxes at the high end, or a Tobin tax on financial transactions. So there are possibilities for taxes, and this is something that could be an alternative way of financing some of the ecological maintenance work that people are doing on a daily basis. Another idea is no loss policies for financing. So financial institutions should actually be prohibited from supporting activities that result in biodiversity loss, regardless of the promises made by offsets or credit programs. They just shouldn't be eligible for funding. It's the same thing with climate. When you start looking at funding for oil and gas exploration, that thing should have been prohibited long ago. We need to find alternative solutions to these, to our energy issues. However, we must also notice the challenge that we're facing with national governments. I think everybody here is probably quite in despair about the way that national governments operate. They tend very much to be tied up with the corporations and bound into a corporate financial agenda. This may be by choice or under pressure, but most national governments are unlikely to eschew development opportunities, especially where they find themselves now. So it's quite unlikely that if there is money for these kinds of funds, that money may be allocated onto the ground, as David was mentioning. In the climate space, people have talked about the possibility maybe of a universal income grant that goes directly to inhabitants rather than going via governments, or rather than stopping at government to then be allocated into different programs and whatever. So there's a possibility also, because ultimately what you want is to equip people who are facing the real impacts of biodiversity loss to have some resources to be able to adapt to that. And a universal income grant could assist with that. But again, we have to organize and fight for these. These are not going to be delivered from the top. Governments are not going to come up with these, and neither is the financial sector going to consider these at all. Ultimately, there is a need to bring finance under democratic control with rational decision making on allocation. This is a bigger question that we really do have to confront. How do we actually bring these institutions under democratic control? It is doable. It's a question of political will. It's a question of thinking about how to do it. I think we should just, my final comment is that we shouldn't always feel that we have to engage with whatever people present. So financial institutions, neoliberal governments can come up with ideas about credits. Let's do this now. Suddenly we must compromise and find ways in which this thing can become workable. I don't think we need to do that. Sometimes we do need to resist these things and come up with alternatives that maybe they don't accept, but they are alternatives that we think will be more just and will work more effectively, and we need to mobilize and organize for those alternatives to become realities. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Stéphane, pour cette présentation assez globale de vos 3 points. C'était assez clair, très dense aussi, une très belle présentation des éléments et surtout à la fin des solutions que vous proposez pour, sur un point qui m'a vraiment plu, c'est celui de dire qu'aujourd'hui, il faut trouver des compromis, certes, mais il faut résister aussi et proposer des alternatives. Et je pense que nous sommes là aujourd'hui pour trouver ensemble des alternatives qui doivent être proposées. Je voudrais, et je sais que tout le monde a trouvé cet échange, ces 2 interventions très pertinentes. Peut-être avant de tomber dans le vif des discussions, je voudrais peut-être passer la parole au 3e intervenant, s'il y en avait. Est-ce qu'il y avait un 3e intervenant, Mr. Yemi? Yemi, you said there were 3 panelists. Oh, it's okay.
Is it possible? I wanted to respond to some of the comments.
Yes, thank you. Yes, nous étions en train de savoir s'il y avait un 3e intervenant avant de passer, de faire des commentaires. But if there is not someone else who is going to make this presentation, then maybe we can go directly with you.
There's no other speaker. Those are the 2
Thank
speakers.
you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
merci. Merci. Donc, nous pourrons donc passer à Madame Cécilia et Monsieur David Oboura qui veut aussi prendre la parole. Donc, Madame Cécilia, merci.
Madam Chair Marie. So this is going to be a contrarian position to what was presented. Coming from the position of discussions that are active right now in the Kenyan government. And I would like to start by saying that it is the Kenyan government that asked experts to come together and figure out so that there's no question that Kenya is going to enter the carbon markets or to engage in biodiversity credits. The question posed to experts is what are the terms of the market and how will Kenya define this in a way that creates benefits sharing? So, and Kenya is not the only country. Ghana is doing it, Mozambique, Zimbabwe. So there are countries that are really taking this to task. Kenya has rejected the route that Ghana and Zimbabwe chose. I think the finding is, I'm not quite sure on the Ghana side. On the Zimbabwe side, the economy is still very closely linked to government control, which is not as much the case in Kenya. The other part is we're spending an inordinate amount of time working with financial experts who have a genuine interest and commitment to getting this right. So I don't think the financial sector can be written off and demonized in one broad stroke. One of the frustrations from finance people is the fact that every system has different layers of complexity. If you analyze the interrelations between microtransactions and macro transactions, those get to be pretty intense. And anytime scientists, environmental experts are asked, they just say it's too complicated, it can't be done. The response from the finance side is that until we try, we're not even going to get close. The other part is, yes, in terms of global emissions, there's an issue there on loss and damage, but we also have to account for our own damages caused within countries. Right now, within Kenya, we have a lot of rapid urbanization that is getting in the middle of wildlife corridors. We don't have a national conservation policy to stop this. We have the fact that without carbon credits, there are those who own community land and are selling it because the simple fact is that for conservation, if you have, let's say, a 30,000 hectare plot, you'll get maybe $14 per hectare, well, you can get for the same amount of land, you can get 3 million per hectare, and they're starving. So when people are starving, they will sell the land, has nothing to do with anybody foreign. This is internal African to Africa trade in Kenya between Africans. They will allow the hotel, the mall, the shopping center to go up because biodiversity conservation does not pay. If we don't get serious about making biodiversity conservation pay, the external threat is nothing. The bigger threat is people on the ground need money. People on the ground are going to sell, and we have no way of telling them, here's a better financial option. And thank you.
Merci, Madame Cécilia, pour votre, voilà, votre point totalement, on va dire, un peu en faveur du système financier qui aujourd'hui se questionne sur des solutions. Je veux passer la parole à Monsieur David Obura et ensuite Leslie. Merci. Et après,
Okay, thank you very much. I'll be brief so others can speak. I just wanted to respond on a couple of things that Stephen said, and I agree with all the caveats that Stephen put out about the dangers of the system ahead of us or that we're in, notwithstanding Cecilia's point that that's the system that we have. But we do need to make it work for us because at the moment financial systems do work for the powerful. They've been designed for those that own capital to strengthen their hold on it. And so finding ways to get around that, of course, is essential. Accountability within our domestic systems is critically important, which was Cecilia's last point. But it's also important in the sphere of the international relations. Our governments calling for joining these markets and so on. We can understand that, but at the same time, we have to hold them accountable to who is benefiting from that system and what are the potential impacts from those systems. And we know that we score pretty poorly on accountability when it comes to finance and impact. So we need to ramp up the pressure on that within our countries. I think Steve really went in detail through many of the specific challenges. And my call was really sort of to step back and think, if we're going to play in this space, we have to, of course, because we're in it, what is a system that can hold accountability and can hold value and in the right places and for who? So that's where really talking about these common systems, I think, is really important. And while there is a strong case to be made for reparation, of course, there's a strong, and we have to identify who has paid for what and who really owes who, as Stephen said. That's why I think reparation is a difficult one to put into financial markets because for all the reasons we know about. And I think framing debt or financial debt as a complementary entity to climate or biodiversity debt, we can see what biodiversity needs to be maintained and restored, or natural assets beyond biodiversity as well. We can see what climate solutions need to be put in place. That needs to be paid for, and it's clear who should pay for that because the consumption and the damages come from. You can follow the money going back decades and centuries as well, because the money is basically what those assets have been transferred into. I think if we can start to shape the discourse around that, so we need to talk in these global systems, we need to talk with the global north, but who is accountable and accountable for what? And I think if we look historically at reparation, it's always very challenging. If we can look forward to repair and adjust in a safe system for all, then at least we're thinking positively and we can push people in the right directions. Of course, it's not easy, but I think that's the sort of directions that I think some of the scholarship and the science is going towards. Thanks.
Merci beaucoup. Madame Leslie, Monsieur Fred.
Yeah, no, thank you so much to all our previous speakers. I think these are critically important issues, and I do agree we have to engage it because whether we want to or not, it's going to affect us, whichever way. But I think in addition to engaging these issues, I also think it's important that we, in one way, it's opportunities. It's a double-edged sword. It's opportunities on the one hand, but it's also threats, as we know. It's been outlined earlier, and I think it's very important that in addition to the defensive work almost that we have to do, that we as ACBA have to define what is the proactive work that we have to build parallel to protecting our interests within this. And I think it just comes back to me again, the language that's resurfacing or that is there already to talk about human rights approaches. David referred to the commons, but I definitely think those sorts of aspects is the proactive aspects we have to start building out as ACBA members. We're doing important work around biodiversity conservation, but the rights work to it is becoming critically important. And I think one way we're going to build in that resilience for ourselves is for us to articulate alongside our conservation initiatives our rights proactively, and that we very much at the community and national level put proactively these actors on notice. Who are we as communities? What are our rights? What are our visions? What are we saying? How are we articulating our rights to our resources and our biodiversity proactively and put them on notice? We've got very important, of course, we know with Nagoya and others, it gives us that strength and tools such as protocols. These various tools, it's not just protocols, there's the commons, there's various approaches that could speak to human rights approaches. And I think for us as ACBA, it is important that our base, in a sense, that we work as the first start to ensure that our base is bulletproof in that sense. Because as we know, the threats are going to come, the effects of climate and all of these things. And I think our strength is to in addition to engaging these opportunities externally, that we also internally do the work of getting our communities to, alongside the critically important work that we're doing, that we add our rights work to this to strengthen and help protect as we go through this. Is just the point that I just wanted to emphasize. Thank you.
Madam Chair, can I say something?
Merci, merci.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm listening critically to an area that I'm not entirely well versed in, but there are a number of things that I totally agree and resonate with me. So I think David's reflections and Stephen's are really strong reflections that we should really keep in mind. I hear your points, Cecilia, but I think we are speaking at different levels. The issues of historical justice have happened. The issues of consumption and it's the way it drives biodiversity loss is continuing to happen. Yes, there are practices on the South and in Kenya and Nairobi that are continuing to erode biodiversity, but there are no comparison to the consumption and production practices in the North and its impact on our biodiversity and climate change. And consequently, the effects that we feel today. And I think that needs to be put into perspective. Yes, there are financial organizations that are trying to do the right thing, but by and large, the system is weighed up against us. The system itself, for those financial institutions, are against them in what they want to do. One could say the same name of oil companies. They will tell you they want to do things right. But by and large, collectively, the oil industry is creating more harm than good. And we need to hold these systems and industries to account. We can't say because the few are trying to do something right, we wouldn't do that per se. So I think we need to put these things into perspective. One of the things that really concerned me up in the lead up to Paris, and which was said quite a lot by a number of organizations that were organizing the Paris meeting, was that the narrative needs to be changed away from justice and rights to other forms of positive dialogue. And I think that's nonsense. Justice and rights needs to be at the center of this dialogue because there is harm being done. And if it's not dealt with, it's not going to change. The role of government is a dicey one, but that's where we come in. We as the people need to hold our governments to account. We need to make as much noise because governments will pander more closely to corporates and to big organizations than to people. But if we speak up, they would listen. 2 days ago, we had a meeting with the Special Envoy for Climate, and they are looking for climate change in Kenya. They are really looking for answers. They're looking for solutions. They don't really know what the best actions are. And we need to put out our ideas as well. In doing that, yes, we should continue to work with private sector and others to improve their practices, but we shouldn't let them go in the fact that their collective industries are doing harm, and we need to figure out a way to hold them to account through systems, through accountability practices, through whatever it takes to bring them to book. And I think we should really stand firm on this. The last point I want to make, the point that was made by David, the financial systems and debts, our biodiversity assets and its value. I think that's really, really critical because at the moment, collectively we are shaft. We think we are poor, but we aren't poor. We have way more than the North has. But because of the financial systems, we are ending up being on the back foot. We need to rebalance that, but it requires some creative thinking in terms of how we do things. So I don't know. My sense is that we are in a very precarious situation, and we need to think hard, pull our arguments together, and continue this dialogue even as we engage. Anyway, those are my reflections.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Fred. Je vois les mains il nous reste quelques minutes, je pense. Nous avons à peu près 9 minutes, donc on va être concis. Je passe la parole à Monsieur Yemi et peut-être après à Monsieur David s'il veut compléter, parce que j'ai vu qu'il a assez intervenu, ainsi de suite, ainsi que Madame Cécile. Merci. Mr. Yemi.
Yeah, no, thanks, Madam Chair. I was going to ask David and possibly Stephen to respond to this whole issue. So this idea that Cecilia was saying that, biodiversity doesn't make money. and climate change makes money. And yet, the carbon market is basically a core benefit of the investments that are going into the management of biodiversity that can contribute towards sequestration, and so on. But how do we kind of moving on? And so there's an issue, this perception that private capital, can come in and solve our problems, and that creating new financial instruments and markets is the solution. But is that the only way we can go? Are there other means for redirecting private capital flows through the interventions of governments? And the public subsidies that go into, we talk about private capital, but a lot of times it takes public money to leverage private finance. And often there's significant amount of public money that is taken. And I think there was a figure thrown around, $4 of public money is leveraging $1 of private, finance. So is there an illusion about this, private capital that is going to solve these problems, and that the only way forward for us to address these things is for the markets to redirect private capital? So I was going to ask, David and Stephen possibly to just share some quick reflections on that. Over.
Okay, I'd love to. Thanks, Yemi. If you don't mind, Stephen, if I go first, mainly from a biodiversity point of view, rather than the sort of markets, which I think you had a lot more detail on. But yes, so that's exactly the problem. Is money only, or the private financialization only addresses some benefits from nature. So carbon has suddenly become of interest in the markets because it has been translated into finance, but at a very low price, and one that is, I think, still about 5% of the estimated value that it should have. So it's a very, while carbon markets are there, useful and important, they're still not valuing carbon at the right levels. We pay for food, we pay for fish, we pay for timber that we extract from nature, but all of the other benefits from nature. So if Bess has identified these 18 classes of nature's contributions to people, all of these other benefit areas are very tangible benefits we get from nature every day in our daily lives. Of course, where nature is most healthy, you get a lot more. Where it's least healthy, you get a lot less. And the lack of those contributions to nature is basically compensated by import from elsewhere. So financial assets enable wealthier economies to import those nature benefits from somewhere else. So I think that there is certainly a lot of scope, and there is a lot of maturity in computational abilities now in natural science to value these different aspects. And we can combine apples and oranges now, so we can compare very different things. But I think the importance there is getting markets to realize, and investment processes to realize, that it's not just about the financial value. If you invest in a mangrove ecosystem, yes, it provides you a certain amount of financial value, carbon sequestration, but the physical value, that carbon sequestration, is what's really important. You also get fish nurseries, you get coastal protection. You can enumerate all the different benefits, some of which can be monetized, many of which cannot be. And so the commons approaches that I'm wondering about need to be ones where you can align all these multiple benefits that people get from nature. You trade some of them, you show the financial value of others, but you show the health, nutrition, and other benefits of others in their physical properties, in their natural, in their native quantities. And you accept and you value those for what they are. The financial markets, sustaining those is a good thing. You get value from that, you get a certain amount of financial return. So we must not fall into the trap of letting financiers and economists dictate what should be in financial markets. We should be able to bring in multiple values, multiple perspectives in identifying what should be included in the equation. And through doing that and being proactive about new commons approaches and protecting these commons is address the problem that Cecilia pointed out, is that at the moment, selling your land to build houses on gives you a lot more money than investing in conservation. So we need to resolve that fundamental problem. And as Fred said, we need to be proactive about doing that. In order to do that, we need safeguards to make sure that we're not allowing initial discussions in carbon or biodiversity credit markets to just sell off pieces of land or pieces of nature that can then be traded around and lost and don't benefit local communities. So it's a huge challenge, but I think we're on the cusp of being able to do that. I think it's important for ACBA and Africa to really take a proactive stand and identify the questions that we need to address and the challenges. We don't have answers yet. We have a lot of questions. Thanks.
Then should I come in here?
Yes, I think yes. Please, Mr. Stefan, go on.
Yeah,
I
thanks.
see a lot of contribution of in the chat room, in the chat also.
Should I proceed?
Go on, Mr. Stefan. You can go on.
Yeah, thank you. So I mean, I appreciate the comments. As I mentioned, it's not like I've still got some catching up to do on this, but I guess we all do in some ways. I think it's very clear, and we should really just get down to the bottom line. The multiple crises which we're facing, and I think everybody can see it now. I mean, everybody around the world is aware that we've got some serious sustainability crises in maintaining human civilization, if you want to get to that point. Social disintegration, financial crisis, huge levels of inequality, destruction of the environment, and just generally unsustainable systems. This is produced by the system that we're in. This system isn't something that is like cast in stone. It's forever. It's created by human beings. There's some human beings who have much more power to dictate what happens than others. And this is the fundamental question that we really have to rebalance. So we can look at the biodiversity, and we can look at the details about biodiversity and how do you try and use finances to reduce the loss a little bit. It's not going to work. The financial system as we've got it now is a root cause of most of the problems that we're facing. This drive for endless accumulation and surplus extraction will continue. It doesn't matter even if those people are friendly and they say they really want to do something. In the back of their mind, they are saying, we want to have what they would think is a win-win situation. You get some, you save some biodiversity on that side, but the flip side is that somebody must be profiting on the other side. So if we're going to stay with this mindset, we're never going to solve this problem. How we change that, it's another story. We need mass action. We need mass mobilization. Of course, very challenging, probably even more challenging than trying to figure out a financial solution to biodiversity and climate change. There's no financial solution to those things. Finances are there to make money. Of course, historically, the financial system was there to lubricate the economy, but I think that we're really in a very different situation now. So why is it that we always look first to say, is this thing profitable? Can money be made? Biodiversity, maintaining ecosystems, nobody can make money off that because it's not something that is valued in the market. So we have to look for alternatives to that. We don't have an option. And I definitely don't think that these things are going to be solutions for us. We must start looking beyond our sectors, integrating all of these: biodiversity, climate, land, water, food systems. They're all integrated. So to me, the last thing I'll say is that when we're thinking about our areas of conservation, biodiversity, these topics, let's also look up and see if we can connect into different networks as well, bring other people dealing with other issues into a dialogue or a conversation, which is not only about the practicalities and the technicalities of what you do right now within the current system, but to start visioning about what kind of alternative system do we want? What kinds of things could we do together? What are the common underlying problems which affect all of these different systems and that are driving the damage that we see now? And then once we find that those common bases, how do we deal with that? What do we do about it? I think that we need to get these under public control. We need to get these under democratic control. And to me, that's probably a key question that we should be asking ourselves about. So those are just some comments from me. I appreciate the time that you have given me to speak here. Thank you.
Merci à vous. Merci pour votre contribution aussi. Je vois la main levée de Monsieur Yemi encore. Mr. Yemi. Please, Mr. Yemi, do you want to take the floor or you are just listening?
It's an old hand, sorry.
Thank you. OK. Donc, merci pour tous les échanges et toutes ces contributions. Et je ne sais pas s'il y a une conclusion ou un élément additionnel que Madame Cécile, je n'ai pas lu toutes les contributions dans le groupe. Est-ce que Madame Cécilia peut avoir un mot juste pour aussi intervenir parce que je n'ai pas lu tous les échanges dans le groupe? Juste un mot après ces réactions. Et ensuite, nous allons conclure, juste des mots de conclusion de la part de M. Yemi et de M. Fred pour conclure notre session d'aujourd'hui. Merci. Can we then have some conclusions of today's discussion? Bonjour à tous. Est-ce que nous pouvons conclure? Il est presque, nous devons mettre un terme à notre débat qui a été très intense. Je voudrais juste demander si le président Fred ou Monsieur Yemi voudrait bien faire un mot de clôture de notre échange. Merci.
Madam Chair, just really to thank, first of all the members for participating, and also to thank David and Stephen for being available at short notice to come and present and to engage in what is really a very important discussion moving forward. And we should see this, what we're calling a mini webinar, as really the beginning. I think that we should take this forward, probably think this thing through a little bit more, bring some other minds together, and try to identify key aspects of this particular topic that we would like to dig deeper into, and organize other engagements. One of the suggestions that Fred made is that we should consider having a side event at Africa Climate Week on this very topic. I think that that's an excellent suggestion, and we should probably look at coming together with a concept note and some speakers, and maybe bring in, besides sort of the biodiversity conservation ecologist community, perhaps bring in also some people in the financial sector to make a contribution to this. So I think that that's a good suggestion, and something that we can actually do and take to Africa Climate Week. So with that, thank you very much, Chair, for moderating today's meeting of